Hello everyone, Miss Carrie here from Miss Carrie's Creations. This month I'm getting ahead of the game and creating some simple Christmas cards with rolled paper and stamped images. These two distressed cards are rather simple to make, and I plan on creating a few more from various patterns that I have in my collection. For the two cards, I'm going to be using some patterns from the scrapbook.com Christmas collection. I also have the matching cardstock pack, a few stamps, and some dies. The cards I'm going to show you use a few of the images on these stamps, but you can easily use any of the others on these two stamp sets for your designs. I'm also going to be using some inks, distressing tools, and a few other items in my craft room. If you would like to know specifically what I'm using today, I have created a supply list in the description below. I'm going to show you how to make the lovely pine tree card first. I have cut my cardstock for the background from an evergreen cardstock, and I'll be layering this soft caramel color over the top. I also have a strip of red pattern paper, a soft white cardstock strip, and some strips of plaid paper that have been cut at 1 1/4 by 3/4. I have cut 14 of these little strips to fit the width of my card. Before I stamp the sentiment and layer the background pieces, I want to distress them a bit with ink and a sanding block. I wanted these cards to have an older country feel with rough edges and inked smudges. The cardstock is a white core cardstock, so sanding is going to allow the white to show through, making it look like it's aged. Around the edges, I am brushing a little distress ink to give it that worn paper look. I'm going to use the same ink to stamp my sentiment. I have grabbed a stamping platform and I'm placing the stamp on the cardstock where I want it to go. I'm going to pick up the stamp with the door of the platform, ink my sentiment, and stamp it right on the cardstock. I'm going to do this a few times so that I can create a darker sentiment. While I have the stamping platform on my desk, I'm also going to stamp the tree design. I have brought over some of the soft white cardstock and iced spruce ink for this. The tree stamp is only about 2 inches wide, so I'm going to need to stamp this repeatedly across the cardstock. I'm starting at the far end of my platform, and I'm lining up the stamp along the edge of the paper. After I've stamped the first image, I'm going to move the cardstock over about 2 inches. Now you can see here that I'm making sure everything's lined up before I ink the stamp for the second image. I'm going to continue moving the cardstock and stamping the images until I get to the end. Now I did cut this cardstock a little longer than I needed, and that will allow me to center the design on my card before I cut it. After stamping the trees, I'm going to add a little ink around the edges, and then I'll show you how to put this card together. Off camera, I added some stitching to the edges of the red paper. If you do not like sewing, but you like the look of stitches, you can also achieve this look with stamps or dies. I'm going to place the red strip across the caramel cardstock. Make sure you don't use too much adhesive on the edges because we are going to be tucking the rolled strips of paper underneath. To add the worn look, I'm going to use an edge distresser on each of these paper strips. This almost reminds me of frayed fabric strips. Before I adhere them to the card, I'm going to shape them a bit. You can do this on the edge of your desk, with a bone folder, or by wrapping it around a tool like I'm doing here. After all the strips are distressed and shaped, I'm going to adhere them in place with some double-sided tape. I'm going to place this along the edge of that red pattern strip, and then I'm going to fold the paper strips and tuck the edges under the red paper strip. Try not to create a crease when you're folding, otherwise you'll lose the look of that rolled paper. If you're worried about messing up the spacing or have OCD like me, here are a few tips to help you keep everything nice and straight. You probably noticed that tape along the top. This is a repositionable tape that I'm using to line up the edges of the strips. It keeps me from tucking too much of the rolled paper strip under my red paper. I'm also balancing out the spacing by placing a few strips on the left side and then a few on the right. I'm able to work out the spacing in the center pieces. Now the ends of my rolled paper strips are sticking into place underneath that red pattern strip. But if for any reason yours seem to come undone, you could add a little bit of glue, or you could adhere the ends of these rolled paper strips together before you tuck them in place. Now that all the paper strips are in place, I'm going to finish adhering the pieces in place. This is a standard A2 size card, so you could make quite a few of them from that scrapbook.com Christmas pattern paper. You can also use a couple of other stamps or collections that you own. To finish off the design, I am going to add a few pops of color. This is called Pearl Orange Sherbet, but surprisingly it matches nicely with the patterns and it brings a little gold color to the design. All right, I'm going to set this aside to dry and then I'll show you how to assemble the second card. This card is a small slimline sized at 3.5 by 6. I have cut the card base for the card and a piece of red pattern paper a little bit smaller than the base. I also have a strip of plaid pattern paper, a strip of deep gray, and 6 poinsettia pattern strips that I've cut at 1 inch by 2 inches. I also have a piece of soft white cardstock and some soft gray that I'm going to be using to cut my die cut sentiment. When these block outlines are cut, you end up with an outline and the letters. You can use them individually or together to create a title for a page or a sentiment for a card. I want those letters to be raised up off the card, but instead of using foam tape, I'm going to apply an adhesive sheet to my cardstock before I cut it out. This is going to make it easier to adhere the layers of letters together. I have cut the outline from the soft gray and I've cut a few sets of letters from white. You can see here that I've also kept the centers of my letters in that soft gray color. Now you don't need to do this, but I found that it helps to create a seamless sentiment. I have started adhering all the letter layers together. I'm just going to use the tip of my die tool to help me peel off the adhesive backing before I adhere these letters. When I cut these letters out, I used a magic mat and a shim in my Big Shot machine. My Big Shot is over 20 years old, so I often need a little extra pressure when I'm cutting through cardstock with an adhesive sheet. It doesn't always cut all the way through the backing of an adhesive sheet. It did cut right through the cardstock, so I am just peeling these letters off like a sticker, and I'm attaching the layers together. This has nothing to do with the dies. I've experienced this with other brands of dies too. It's basically because my machine is old like me and it doesn't always like to cut through the thicker materials. Before I assemble the card, I need to stamp my sentiment. I'm going to heat emboss this using some Versamark ink and fine white embossing powder. I have brought over my stamping platform again and I'm lining everything up on the cardstock. Now this sentiment says Merry Christmas, but I only want the portion that says Christmas. So I'm going to cover the word Merry with some repositionable tape before I apply the ink. After applying the ink on the stamp, I'm going to remove the tape, then I'll stamp the sentiment onto my cardstock. This allows me to only stamp the portion that I want to use. Now I'm going to go sprinkle this with some white embossing powder, heat it with a heat tool, and I'll start assembling the card. Off camera, I added some stitching to the plaid paper strip. Again, this is optional and it can be achieved with dies or stamps. I've also distressed the edges of my smaller paper strips, and now I'm adding a little bit of ink to the edges before I adhere everything in place. The red pattern paper will be sitting in the center of the card base with that green pattern paper strip across the center. I'm going to use double-sided tape to help me secure the rolled paper strips in place. I have positioned some repositionable tape on the card to help me line everything up, and I'm starting with the sides and working my way to the center. Once the rolled paper strips are in place, I can add my sentiments. The Christmas strip is going to be placed right above the plaid strip, overlapping it slightly, and the Merry die cuts are going to be placed over the cardstock. I'm going to adhere the frame in place first with some strips of foam tape, and then I'll fill in the letters. You don't necessarily need the foam behind the outline, but I like adding dimension to my cards, so I added some thinner tape. These letters are going to sit a little higher than the outline, making it look like I used a thicker tape. Creating solid letters with multiple layers of cardstock gives me that raised look without having the gap underneath it that foam tape would create. Remember how I said that I kept the centers of the letters? If you didn't have the foam tape in place, your pattern paper would show through the holes of the letters. I wanted this to appear like a seamless sentiment, so I'm adding those centers in the soft gray that matches the outline. Now that all the letters are in place, I'm going to add a few pops of color using glitter Snowflake. If you haven't used these before, here's a little trick that I learned. Start with just a little dot, then tap the paper underneath the dots. This will cause them to spread, making them look almost like acrylic dots. I love how well this technique works. All right, now that both cards are complete, let's take a look at them together. The first card we created is a simpler design with a distressed, worn feel. It has a nice country Christmas vibe with that frayed paper and inked edges, and the stamped images are simple and soft. The second card is a little bit more bold with that large sentiment, but the rolled paper gives the look of loops of ribbon and it softens the card a bit. Both of these are easy to create and can be made using any of the stamps or papers in the collections I showed you, or you could even use items you own. Even though Christmas is quite a few months away, this is a great time of year to work on holiday projects. I'm stocking up on a few of the Christmas in July sale items because once the holidays come, I won't have time to make anything at all, and my friends will go another year without getting a Christmas card. I want to thank you for joining me for this fun Christmas in July project. I will be placing photos of these cards on my blog later today for you to save to your inspiration boards. If you have any questions about this project or the supplies I used, feel free to comment below. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I can't wait to see what you create.